Wasteland was a place where all the little mice lived and played, were born and died. And they lived much as you and I do. They even had a parliament. And every 4 years they had an election. They used to walk to the polls and cast their ballot. Some of them even got a ride to the polls. Got a ride for the next 4 years afterwards, too. Just like you and me.
Bruise my pride and bust my face, scatter my rights all over the place, and take the bread from off my plate. But you can't break me, lock me out, chain the gates, put black shirts in with dogs and mace. I'll hold the line, won't step away, 'cause you can't break me. I belong, you belong, we belong to the Union. I belong, you belong, we belong to the Union.
Welcome to Rebels, Reds, and Radicals, the podcast about the history of the left around the world. Because to figure out where we are going, we must understand where we came from. I'm Matt, and with me today is my co-host,
Jules.
Welcome to our very first episode.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting to finally get something like this started. You know, it's been a dream of mine to start a history podcast. I'm glad it's with you.
Aw, thanks. In my time as a leftist, I have come to find there are three kinds of leftist figures in the popular imagination. First, we have the ignored, the folks who fought for the betterment of humanity, but are left out of history books for being too radical. Your Victor Debs, your Emma Goldman, etc., etc. Second, we have your villains, those whose actions are used to vilify even moderate reforms. Your Stalin, your Mao, your Pol Pot. And third, we have the whitewashed, those people who are both remembered in the public imagination, but are too well liked to be considered villains. So very often their politics are obfuscated or just simply not brought up at all to avoid letting credibility to their radical ideas. Martin Luther King Jr. is a good example of this. Often his more radical beliefs about capitalism and war are scrubbed off. This way, liberals and conservatives alike can warp his beliefs for brownie points. And this is also true of today's subject. Tommy Douglas, the father of Canadian single-payer healthcare. Now, most Canadians are at least familiar with Tommy Douglas. He has his own section in the Canadian Museum of History. In 2004, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation held a vote to see who was the greatest Canadian out of our history, and Tommy Douglas came in first, beating out the co-discoverer of insulin, Dr. Frederick Banting, inventor of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, and racist incoherent hockey man, Don Grapes Cherry.
You gotta love them Canadians.
Yes.
They sure know how to pick them. The
sad thing is, I have met at least a few people's fathers who have kind of a Don Cherry energy to them.
All right.
Yeah. Most recently, in 2019, Ontario's premier and hockey goon Doug Ford tried comparing himself to Tommy Douglas for political clout. He was very quickly called out for cutting funding to Ontario's healthcare system, including by Tommy's grandson, Keither Sutherland. Yes, 24's Keither Sutherland. However, despite this, many Canadians don't know, or conveniently ignore, that Tommy Douglas was a socialist who the Doug Fords of his day derided as a dangerous radical. So, who was Tommy Douglas? What exactly did he believe? How did he fight for working-class Canadians? And what can we take from him as a historical figure? Our journey to find the answers will take us to the misty shores of Scotland, the grassy plains of Saskatchewan, a Los Angeles County jail, and to the halls of Canadian power in Ottawa. So sit back as we go over the life of Tommy Douglas.
Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that, our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp. The man's the gowd for all.
Tommy Douglas isn't necessarily Canadian. He was actually born in Falkirk, Scotland on October 20th, 1904. His parents were Tom and Annie Douglas, and for the first few years of his life, his family lived in a house that was actually owned by his grandfather, also conveniently named Thomas. I'm starting to guess that they really had no ideas as to what to name him, but as my co-hosts will probably tell me, it's probably a naming convention back then.
Yes, it was. It's like a Scottish thing. Yeah, like it's he's like a pretty big. He's like one of like a pretty. There's like a lot of Scottish Canadians. The part of Canada I'm from is actually where a lot of Scottish people settled, and I know like a lot of the farmers now really regret it because part of the reason they settled here is because the terrain's very similar to Scotland. Like it's a lot of hills and a lot of rocky soil, so that means like every time you are tilling a field, you're digging up like a billion stones. Like even just like doing political campaigns in my area, it's so difficult because every time you try to stick in like a campaign sign, there's a rock in the fucking ground. And also just like kind of a fun fact, Tommy Douglas actually, because my hometown actually has like a pretty like notable Highland Games every year, and Tommy Douglas actually like gave the opening speech in like I think it was 1966.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah,
good for him. Going back to that Scottish heritage right there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was, like, really down for that. The main biography we use for a lot of the information for this podcast, which is just simply Tommy Douglas by Doris French Shackleton. It goes over a little bit about how much his Scottish heritage played a role in his early years, and they were talking about how even well into the 70s, he was still, like, getting hired just to speak at various Burns nights all across the country, and he would have to, like, book months in advance.
Oh, that's cool. No, I'm glad that worked out for him, because I know a lot of immigrants probably don't like to keep that part of identity with them, but I think it helps that he's actually Scottish and not something like, you know, more maligned in today's day and age,
or like maligned back then.
Yeah,
this was still back in the time when like people were worried that Irish Catholics were like going to like sell out America to the Vatican or some shit.
hey, I get it. Okay. You know, Catholics aren't really all that common in like North America, except for maybe Mexico. So yeah. I completely get it.
Well, and in Quebec's like pretty like Catholic, but that's because like it was settled by the French.
Yeah, of course, it's always the French. All right, Tommy was born into a pair of iron molders, which was his dad, and so they settled nearby an iron factory, Cairn Iron Works, which made cannons apparently for the British Army because. Why not? And box those that kept many Canadian families warm during the winter. Because as we all know, Canadian winters are pretty harsh. So, and then here's the interesting part. Tom served in the Second Boer War and in India as a part of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, which obviously means that, you know, his dad fought because he was Scottish and, you know, God save the Queen and all that shtick. Well, of course, he hated it. And since it was brutal and punishing being a foot soldier in the British Army, upon coming home, Tommy's dad joined the British Labour Party, as one does if someone's frustrated with the crown. and then Tom's dad evicted Thomas over this. And so the two men, they would go on this for a while until they eventually made amends, mostly because Thomas wanted to know his own grandson, in this case being Tommy. If this is all confusing, trust me, it's even more confusing to read about.
Yeah, so like that first chapter of Tommy Douglas's biography gets really confusing because you sort of lose track. Wait, which Tom is this?
And if you notice, I probably lost track in my own speaking about this, so you can just tell how confusing all this is.
If there was never a point in which someone like walked into the Douglas's homestead asking for Tom, and like 3 different people answered at once, I would be very surprised.
Oh no, I wouldn't be surprised either. I guess that's why they all use nicknames.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it eventually came to a point where all of Tommy's uncles became Labour Party members as well. Although they were not so much enthusiastic about it as he was. So just from an early age, you know, you can see the seeds of being something of a socialist starting to come about. Not necessarily, you know, full blown, because of course, you know, back then the ideas weren't fully formed just yet. But Tommy's parents will also want him to get a full education, mostly because, you know, immigrants back then, much like the immigrants of today, usually immigrate to give better opportunities, whether that be education, economic, that sort of thing. And so they would spend Sundays drilling Tommy and his brothers and sisters. Whether they not had sisters, I actually didn't research that part. Did he have brothers? Yeah,
he had 2 younger sisters, as I recall.
Oh, okay. And so they were oddly enough making memorize passages from Robert Louis Stevenson and Walter Alva Scott. So, of course, Robert Stevenson being the author of Treasure Island and everything, which is only a book I have never read except in the form of Treasure Planet, which, if anyone wants to know, is a pretty fun movie.
Oh, yeah, that That's like kind of it's a flawed but still kind of underrated Disney movie. That was back when they were trying to appeal more to the sort of people who wanted action adventure than like the typical Disney fare. And like it was interesting that at least that Disney was trying to experiment, especially now we live in this age where they're just like remaking all of their classic movies but live action.
Oh yeah. No, I love it. It's honestly one of the more underrated Disney pieces. But going back, the problem was Tommy was so sick that, he had a hard time doing all this while actually going out and doing stuff. So for a large portion of his early life, he was freakingly sick, at least with something. And so at the age of 6, Tommy developed probably one of the worst sicknesses you could probably get at that age, pneumonia. And then right after recovery, he cut his own knee on a rock and developed, oh my God, this is hard to pronounce, osteomyelitis?
I think it's
or a bone.
Yeah, like a bone infection, basically.
Yeah, yeah, right below his kneecap. So that's gonna hurt.
Yeah, he got a bad case of bonitis.
Yeah. So when they tried to get a local doctor to try to perform surgery on this knee, of course, it didn't go all that well. It didn't go all that well. So, to quote Tommy Douglas from Doris Shackleton's very famous biography, the kitchen table was pressed into service. Mother and grandmother administered chloroform. No sooner had the doctor left than a suture came loose. There was considerable bleeding, and the doctor had to be found and brought back to repair the damage. And the leg was still in poor shape when the family made its first migration to Canada. So, as you can tell, early 20th century medicine in a rural part of Scotland is not necessarily the best medical things you can get.
I believe this is, as Robert Evans likes to describe, the time where whiskey was still considered medicine.
I'm pretty sure it's still considered medicine to a lot of people. At least an unhealthy form of medicine. Get help, guys, please. Alcoholism is not cool.
Please get Medicare for all America.
Oh man, I wish. And so by 1910, Tommy's family had moved to Manitoba, specifically Winnipeg, and the neighborhood they moved into, Gladstone Street, was something not too unlike a scene from St. Clair's The Jungle. All right, you had cheaply made rental housing, outdoor toilets, and a community of European immigrants who worked for the local Vulcan Iron Works. So as you can probably tell, it's kind of a hellhole. Basically any sort of urbanized city during the industrial age. Especially
like a city like Winnipeg, because this was like in the era in Canadian history when like the western provinces, particularly the prairie provinces, were still in the midst of being settled by European immigrants. Like the settlement process wouldn't really be officially done until like the mid 1920s in a sense. So like these were still like if you've ever seen like some of the towns in Red Dead Redemption 2 where like the roads still aren't paved and everyone's all kind of crowded into housing. A lot of like cities like Winnipeg were kind of like that at the time.
Oh, okay. That makes sense for the time period. And so the Douglases themselves were one of the only two families actually originating from the UK. Here Tommy started attending elementary school. Good for him, Always get that good public education. However, his bone disease frequently led to flare-ups and hospital visits. So that didn't necessarily help him try to be on time or even be there during a lot of his schooling. And so one winter, he actually required the help of two of his Eastern European classmates, pulling him on a sled just to get to class. And if that's not the most Canadian thing I've ever heard, I don't know what is.
But I hate to get into this because, admittedly, a lot of the romanticization of like the settlement of the West is kind of like a settler colonial myth, and it sort of like tries to gloss over the fact that a lot of these people were basically like taking the land away from the people who originally inhabited it. But there is one thing I do consider commendable about that era. It's that you sort of do see like a certain level of solidarity between a lot of the immigrants that there who are trying to basically survive in this strange new land. It doesn't like cancel out the fact that they were still white settlers and all the baggage that comes with it, but it is at least nice to see like those little bits of solidarity.
Yeah. No, it's definitely one of the better aspects. Of course, it's not. It's the good does not outweigh the bad in that kind of situation.
It's like kind of the complex thing about like settler culture that there is like sort of like a rugged sort of solidarity that can be built up between people who are sort of like away from the established settlements but at the same time, there's still the fact they're taking land away from the people who originally lived there and basically aiding in genocide.
Yeah, no, like a lot of things in history. If you're going to take away one thing from this podcast, listeners, is that history is nuanced. Okay, there's either something that's either good nor bad. Like there's lots of shades of gray in between. If you look to history for easy answers, you're not going to get any. Trust me. As someone who's starting
at least
to become
like
a
honest
historian.
history. If you want a history that just like makes you feel good for being a white settler, I don't know, listen to Stefan Molyneux or some bullshit, or don't.
Or don't. It's good.
Actually,
that
he probably can't. He's probably still kicked off of YouTube.
No, he's kicked off of YouTube. Trust me.
And hopefully he stays there.
Yeah, because he does bad history. He truly does bad history.
Yeah, like ignoring his politics, his history is just like no.
Like he doesn't ever post scholarly journals. He doesn't do peer review. He doesn't actually like cite his sources, which is kind of like a big no-no.
Everyone knows peer review was created by the Frankfurt School. Come on.
Oh, that's okay. That's funny because that's not true. No, but if any of you listeners really want to go look into where we got everything, the sources will be posted in the description below. So in Chicago format, because that's what historians use. but back to the Tommy Douglas story. Sorry for that tangent. If you really do want to hear more from us,
get us doxxed.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay, so because of this continued leg injury, Tommy really did have to being started admitted to the hospital again because it was just starting to flare up way too much, and of course something had to be done with it. So when he was awaiting surgery one day, the doctor told his parents that they would basically have to amputate his leg for not to mince words. This guy was about to lose his leg just because he scraped his leg on a rock and then it infected the bone. That's what you call being taken down by 20th century incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
And so entered Dr. R.H. Smith, an orthopedic surgeon at that hospital, leading medical students to bold new frontiers, right? That's how the book portrays him, right?
Yeah. They don't specify if this was a teaching hospital, but I'm assuming that it either was, or at the very least, he was basically giving like these medical students job placement, I guess is probably the best word, just like a hands-on training.
Oh, okay, so it basically was a teacher hospital from what I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Dr. Smith, seeing an opportunity to not only teach his students, he told Tommy's parents that he would do the leg surgery for free, basically guaranteeing him, guys, I'm going to fix this boy's leg, and it's going to be so good that you don't even have to pay for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm guessing that Dr. Smith was just expecting, some more mobility, just being able to at least use the leg and not having to pull it around like dead weight.
Yeah, so according to the book, there was the expectation that Tommy, he would be able to walk, but, his leg would be overly stiff, but they were actually surprised to find out that his leg actually regained its, full mobility after the surgery.
Yeah, so, it's basically a surgery in the opposite way, going worse than expected. It actually went better than expected, which, for the time, is pretty miraculous when you think about it.
That's when you know, right? That's when you know you got, you got the good luck roll.
Exactly. So, Tommy, when reminiscing about this moment regarding his operation, said, "My father had no coverage for accidents or medical needs. There was no workman's compensation, and there was nothing for the families of the poor. To go to an orthopedic surgeon was for us simply out of the question. And if my father had been seriously disabled on his work, there would have been no money to take care of my mother, my sisters, or myself. When I thought about it, I realized that the same kind of service that I got by a stroke of luck should have been available to every child in that ward, and not just to a case that looked like a good specimen for exhibition to medical students." And I think he does bring up a good point. There's a lot of things that happen with going into a backbreaking labor like that, and one of the things is susceptibility to injury. Construction workers are in a dangerous line of work, and I'm pretty sure Tommy's dad was also in a very dangerous line of work with ironworking.
Oh, definitely.
And so it does help to get workman's compensation, workers' comp, right? Because if you do get injured, that means you don't have to basically stretch your money out so thin to the point where you're struggling to live, right? And so I'm glad that he got that perspective on it, and not just, I'm glad this doctor, was able to save my leg and that's it. He thought of the repercussions of it. Imagine if he didn't have this specific unique problem that was able to give the medical students a lesson. Right.
Yeah, like he was basically lucky that there just happened to be like a sympathetic doctor that was just coming by, and there was like probably a dozen other kids in that same ward who also had serious conditions, but like it didn't seem like a good enough case study.
Yeah, and so I mean, power to him to get for him giving that, either whether it is because of his like political beliefs that he thought about it that way, or it was him just coming to that conclusion. That's still a very insightful conclusion to come at it with, because I know a lot of people would just say, "Oh, I just got lucky and got a good doctor that would help me," right? Mm-hmm. And I just look at it like the repercussions of that doctor not being able to operate on you.
Yeah, and it's honestly like the right thing to take from that situation. Like you sort of realize that I should not have been able to like get this best case scenario just because of luck. This should have been something that should have been available to literally everyone in this hospital without any sort of like special circumstances.
Yeah, and so I think he really just got some perspective on it and thought about it that way, and I'm glad he did. And so moving on, I'm sorry for that little tangent. I just thought it was interesting the way he thought about it that way. It's always interesting to go into sort of like, not like the psychology, because I can't get a good picture on it, and I'm not a psychology major at all, but just like think about why he thought of it that way. By 1914, with the onset of World War I, Tommy's father decided to reenlist, but he pulled a Desmond Doss. He was inspired by a social pacifist of that time, and so he only insisted on enlisting if he couldn't carry a weapon. He ended up becoming Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps member as an ambulance driver. So that basically allowed him not to carry a weapon. And so Tommy's mom, not wanting to be so far away from
yeah, like on the other side of the Atlantic,
Tommy,
basically.
Yeah, moved the family to Glasgow again. Here with Scotland. They basically lived off $1 a day, which, okay, back then, granted, was a lot more than it is now.
Well, yeah, but
right?
I actually like looked it up, and it's still pretty low wages, because like Tommy's father's full wage was like $1.10 a day, and like even for back then, that was still like pretty low wages.
I know inflation's a thing, guys. Okay, I'm just saying, even $1 a day back then was kind of not sustainable.
Yeah.
Trust me, I've researched this. Okay, inflation doesn't magically make $1 grow into like $20 an hour. So Tommy's mom had to sell sewing machines. Tommy, on the other hand, did various odd jobs. At one point, he was an assistant to a local owner of a cork factory, and because of this job paid so well that Tommy ended up actually dropping out of school so he could actually stay and be the assistant of this owner.
And he also learned like Spanish and Portuguese in order to get that job. Like originally, he was just doing kind of odd jobs for this guy, and then he was like, okay, I need someone to be like a cork buyer, and because I'm not too familiar with like the intricacies of like cork manufacturing, but I'm assuming that meant having to deal with like traders from Spain and Portugal. So Tommy had to learn like two new whole languages, at least enough to like be able to barter with these guys. Also, apparently one of his other early jobs was being an assistant at a barber shop, and he was basically the kid who would have to put the foam in the men's beards so that the barber could do the shaving. And he would actually apparently like get his hands like all slightly cut up because he had all these men with like really wiry beards, and like you're just sort of like moving your hand, so it's essentially like sticking your fingers in like steel wool.
Well, that's one way to describe it.
No, I mean, these old-timey sorts of jobs, it's the same thing I got when I first went through the jungle. You sort of realize, man, like a lot of these old-fashioned jobs, they're actually like a lot less like quaint as you look at when you're watching like old silent movies or something. Yeah,
I mean, it's just good for him for learning two different languages just so he could be paid as an assistant to a cork factory and eventually become a seller. I mean, that's pretty impressive even back then.
Yeah.
I mean, it's especially impressive considering back then. I mean, I'm pretty sure an emphasis was never put on learning multiple languages.
Yeah, like this was in Canada. This was before we were bilingual. This was back when even in Quebec there was an expectation that you had to learn English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, good for him. And so continuing, because we're getting a lot of tangents here, but I just think it's interesting, a lot of his aspects of his life.
Oh yeah,
being American myself, I never heard of this guy before. My co-host told me about him. So it's been interesting learning about him.
Yeah,
so far.
It's really like interesting considering that, like we mentioned earlier, this is the grandfather of Keithur Sutherland. Just 2 generations before is the guy who, well, we'll go into the details later, but like played a significant role in the establishment of the Canadian healthcare system that's so often talked about in American politics.
So that's why we're telling about his very life. And I'm sorry for getting through this very slowly considering all the tangents, but Please bear with us. We're getting to it. During this period in time in Glasgow, it was the time of Red Clydeside.
I believe that's
I have no idea what
yes.
that is. Okay.
Like Clydeside
Glasgow,
is essentially what people in Glasgow call the area that borders the River Clyde.
Oh, okay. So Glasgow, like many industrial cities in the era, was a buzzing hive of trade unionism and social activism. Tommy would often spend his free time watching radical preachers and socialist agitators openly decrying the war and conscription. Now, if this was America in 1918, they definitely would have been thrown in jail.
Oh yeah, we're going to be covering like Eugene
around.
Debs very soon. So like we'll talk about how America dealt with socialists during World War I.
And trust me, the Red Scare was not just in the 1950s and 60s. People.
Or not just in America, but we'll be getting into that in a few minutes.
Exactly. In 1953, Tommy visited Glasgow and noticed a bronze bust of one of these socialists, Jimmy Maxton, leader of the Independent Labour Party. Douglas quipped, "It confirmed my impression that there is nothing the upper classes are so fond of as a dead radical," which, honestly, Martin Luther King, dead radical, and people love him. So
yeah, or even just like Tommy, like we pointed out earlier, conservatives will like compare themselves to Tommy Douglas just for the clout of it, despite very clearly if Tommy Douglas was alive today, he would be like a thorn in their side.
It was during his stay in Glasgow that he was introduced to another great current in his life, the Baptist Church. Yes, people, he was religious. Not all socialists back then were irreligious as they are today. I believe. If I'm wrong, please correct me on that. It's just one of the core tenets of socialism, I think, is irreligiousness, but I could be wrong. I haven't read that much theory in a long time.
At least from my understanding, it's kind of a mix. At this era, certain sects of the Protestant Church, the Baptists, and a couple of others I'm forgetting the exact names of at this point, there were like parts of them, particularly in more radical areas that had like a lot of industrial unionists at the time, where people were taking the Bible and just saying, well, look, the Bible says, hoarding wealth is bad. We should help our fellow men no matter what. We should seek peace, not war. Why are we not trying to establish this in this world? Although, of course, I should point out that this wasn't universal even within the Baptist Church. It was not uncommon for Tommy later in his life to clash with other Baptist ministers who took the more conservative Christian line, where everything in the world is because of God. You're poor because God wants you to be poor. You're rich because God wants you to be rich. That sorts of thing. And there's even, I forget the exact quote, but there's one quote from the biography we've been using where Tommy basically complained about how he would talk to Eastern Canadian Baptist crowds who are too busy complaining about the current dance trends and women being less moral than they were back in the day, while there were literal fascists marching in Europe and people starving in the streets.
I'm glad to see that that even older generations saw these problems with people, because now it's just come full circle, Even back then, people were complaining about women's clothing. I mean, they can't win, man. Moving on. Tommy's mother brought him and his sisters closer to the Baptist Church. This was an era of the social gospel, like co-host Matt mentioned, in which many used the teachings of the Bible to argue in favor of social reform. Like you said, this wasn't necessarily universal to a lot of the Christian sects at the time, but it was in Tommy's, I guess, particular parish, as we Catholics would probably call it.
It was particularly common in England at this time. It was actually very formative to the early British Labour Party, and it was especially prevalent in Western Canada for reasons we'll get into once we get back to Canada.
And so, because of this large religious influence, Tommy would actually get a lot of his speech points from pastors in their sermons, right? And so he used a hymn from William Blake that he would go on to use in one of his own speeches, where it says, "I shall not cease from moral strife, nor shall my sword rest in my band, till we have built Jerusalem in this green and pleasant land." Now, if that's not a fire lyric, I don't know what is, because I don't know who made that rhyme. I don't know how William Blake came up with that rhyme, but that's catchy.
Yeah,
I'll give him that.
And it's one very commonly associated with Douglas. There's at least one biography talking about the New Jerusalem, which is what a common phrase he would use to describe his idealized view of what Canada could be under a planned economy where the rights and well-being of all Canadians were basically protected by the government, both economically as well as legally.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean that's good for him. If religion really helped him out, then what am I to say that it wasn't good for him? But of course, not everything is good, as we will discuss later. Back to his biography. So by late 1918, of course, in World War I, the Germans would eventually surrender, and the war would be over. The young Douglas family decided to move back to Canada, with Annie and the kids leaving ahead of Tommy's father. On New Year's Day, 1919, they would sail home to Canada, although not before the ship almost tipped over to the crew being pissed drunk. Oh God, you gotta love sailors. They just know.
Like the ship was starting to list, and all the other soldiers who were like already coming home, because this was just as demobilization was starting up. All the soldiers who weren't drinking, like all the sailors were, had to like rush out to like move, because all the cargo wasn't strapped on properly, so it was causing it to sort of list, and they all had to like shove it over to keep the ship from like capsizing.
Of course. By the time they got back to Winnipeg, the family had to work a lot to make ends meet, as one does if you're moving to a new country. Tommy's dad went back to the ironworks, of course, and his sister started working in a local department store. Tommy himself got a job as an apprentice printer for the Richardson Press. It was while he was delivering copies of the Grain Trade News that Tommy witnessed one of the greatest moments in Canadian radical history, the Winnipeg General Strike.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the Winnipeg General Strike is a major historical event in and of itself, and is on the list of future episode topics for us. Of course, my co-host is, of course, Canadian, so he does love his Canadian history.
Yeah, especially the lefty Canadian history.
Yeah, it's interesting, to say the least. But we will explain the basics for the sake of this context, because if we don't, then, we don't have a foundation to formulate a good picture of Tommy's future.
Yeah, especially because I've always been aware of the Winnipeg General Strike. It's something that if you ever pick up any one of these like books on like Canadian history that they make for kids, they'll usually show the same iconic photo of like a bunch of strikers like knocking over a tram car. But I remember I never really had like a strong idea of what exactly the Winnipeg General Strike was until I actually started looking it up on my own. And admittedly, like a part of that was my attitude towards history at the time, but also as we'll get into the specifics here, but there's definitely a reason why a lot of certain groups of people wouldn't want like kids to know about the reasons why the general strike happened.
Yeah, exactly. In the years following the First World War and the Russian Revolution, general strikes popped up all over the industrialized world, including Canada. Soldiers coming home after 4 years of brutal warfare, and we're talking brutal. If any of you ever played Battlefield 1, well, guess what? It's much worse than that. And that was already pretty brutal. So those people didn't find themselves with work or housing like you would eventually in World War II, when you had things like the GI Bill in America. And I'm guessing Canada had something very similar.
In fact, specifically, a lot of stuff like the GI Bill was to prevent the kind of like stuff that former soldiers were doing after the First World War because of the lack of support. Yeah.
And so that's why they're quote unquote called the lost generation. I don't know if that's something that they themselves created, or it was given to them after, but they were definitely
it was given to them after. Like a lot of the generation terms we've had for the last century were coined in like a very specific book, as I recall.
Yeah. So I mean, but lost generation does definitely work for that specific subset of people, because of what happened with the World War I, where a lot of people lost their teenage years, even their innocence, to a war that was essentially just because alliances happened. And because of this, the ones who did find work were generally under very brutal and dehumanizing conditions, which is nothing, and that's basically not an improvement to what they were already doing in the war. Because of this, workers in cities across Canada held general strikes, as one does if you're unhappy. Right, at least back then. Now you can't really do that. With Winnipeg being the center of this movement. Here, workers printed newspapers calling out their bosses and paraded through the streets against capitalism, because, why not at that time? All in all, it's what Canada's Bay Street traders, mining barons, and oil oligarchs see in their nightmares.
Yeah, for context for any non-Canadians listening, Bay Street's like Canada's equivalent to Wall Street.
Oh, so it's basically a bunch of young people trying to game the system.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. It's where our stock market is. It's where a lot of our biggest corporations have their headquarters.
I see. And so Tommy would be there to witness the tragic end of the strike. He and a friend climbed up a metal pole to get a rooftop view of a crowd of workers as officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force showed up. So this is where, if any of you have any preconceived notions that the Mounties are just basically a joke, get ready for a wild ride.
Yeah,
The
welcome
RCMP.
to reality, folks. The Mounties are not friendly.
The RCMP would charge towards the workers with clubs and guns, shooting one dead and injuring dozens more. Before long, the government would begin cracking down on not just the striking workers, but on leftists around the Dominion. In that moment, Tommy only understood it as a dumb teenage boy, as an explosion of violence and action. It was upon reflection years later that Tommy would realize that day for what it was, the brutal suppression of the working class by the rich. Which, yes, it basically was.
Yes, it very much was. Obviously, if we do end up covering the general strike as its own episode, we'll go more in detail. But as a result of the general strike, the government introduced Section 98 of the Criminal Code of Canada, which I think it was taken off the record until like the 1950s or 60s. I need to double check that. But it gave the government carte blanche to go after revolutionary organizations. So it was used to crack down on like communist and socialist and trade union groups as the government saw fit. And it was actually a part of the platform of the CCF, the party that Tommy would eventually become a major part of, to basically remove Section 98 because it was, a violation of freedom of speech.
Years later, Tommy would continue to work hard to bring money into his family, of course. While the Douglas family was never extremely impoverished, they still felt the pinch of being a part of the working class in the 1920s. Tommy himself frequently argued with his father about going back to school, with Tommy feeling that him finishing high school was a luxury that they couldn't afford, which, if we're being honest, it probably was true.
Yeah, this was very much a time where it was not uncommon for people to drop out of high school or even elementary school because they had younger brothers or sisters that needed to be taken care of, so they needed to get a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. So that's basically what the concept was here. So Tom himself was almost permanently disabled on the job multiple times. He must have been really lucky that he didn't. Once almost taking hot iron ore to the eye, and this time such an injury would have been a death sentence for the family, losing their major source of income. Man, this guy just does not know how to not get injured. I swear.
This was before a lot of the safety regulations for industrial workplaces started to become a common thing. Mm-hmm. So again, if you've ever read The Jungle, you probably know the kind of bullshit factory workers would often have to go through on a daily basis.
Nah, it's okay. I've read the plot synopsis on Wikipedia. I'm pretty sure that gives me a full picture of what The Jungle is about.
I really want to talk about Upton Sinclair on the show at one point, so I'll just save the points of The Jungle for that.
Yes, of course. So despite his work, Tommy could still find time for other activities. He boxed, training at the One Big Union Gym in Winnipeg, and even briefly becoming the lightweight champion in Manitoba for a brief time. Good for him, honestly, It's always good to see accomplishments like that.
Yes, but I should also point out the name One Big Union. One Big Union was essentially Canada's equivalent to the IWW. That was sort of our regional version. It was a syndicalist trade union, which basically means society that's basically run by unions. And they were a major part in planning the Winnipeg General Strike, and the government cracked down on them pretty hard. Although I guess they still operated this one gym where they didn't change the name. I'm not sure why it still had that name. And also, I should point out the author of the biography I was using, Doris Shackleton, she slagged them off because, admittedly, she has a bit of a political bias because she ran as an NDP MP, so obviously she's more for electoralism and a less overtly radical form of leftism than groups like One Big Union or the IWW would have supported. But at the same time, it's just really weird, this book about a well-known socialist that's talking about these one big union types were trying to think that all society is divided by class. And I'm like, what? Am I reading this correctly?
Oh, that's funny.
But going on.
Yeah, like we said before, despite his work, he had done all this stuff. And so he eventually became a member of the Order de Molay, which was basically a version of the Freemasons. He became his chapter's chaplain since he was very familiar with the Bible by this point. Chaplain?
Yeah, it's pronounced chaplain,
right.
Like Charlie Chaplin.
I'm sorry. Sorry about that. My pronunciations can be a little off sometimes.
It's all right.
It's okay. One evening, he improvised a prayer for some boys when they were born in fire that night. The impressed senior dad and the future Manitoba Attorney General W.J. Major advised him to go back to school and join the ministry, as one does if you see someone who's very promising. So by this point, Tommy had worked at the printers long enough to have earned his journeyman's papers, which is basically the thing after you become an apprentice, before you've become a fully fledged tradesman. Tommy, after all these years, finally decides to go back to school.
And as I was turning the handle, and they were pouring in the milk, and I could see the cream coming out of one spout and the skim milk coming out of the other spout, one day it finally penetrated my thick Scotch head. This cream separator is exactly like our economic system. Here are the primary producers, the farmers and the fishermen and the loggers. They're pouring in the milk. And here are the workers. Whether they work on the railroad or go down to the mines or sail ships or work in a store or a bank or teach school, clerk in the store, work in a hospital, they're the people whose services make the economy go round, and they're turning the hand.
Yeah, I should point out that Annie, his mom Annie, was thrilled about him joining the ministry. His father Tom was far more secular than his wife and children, could really care less.
Of course.
I've heard very mixed things about Tom's personality. The stuff from Doris Shackleton seems to show that he wasn't like a super close father, but he did respect some of the stuff that Tommy believed in. But I know at least one documentary I came across described him as a lot more cold and distant, and I think it might be somewhere in the middle, especially considering the time and era where you had a lot of fathers who weren't particularly close with their sons because of societal expectations. But also it's just really funny how much Tommy's dad did not give a shit about the church when Tommy was being I forget the specific thing because I'm pretty secular myself, but it wasn't like a baptism, but it was essentially being brought closer into the Baptist church. And Tommy's dad pulled out a bottle of beer, cracked it open, and offered the priest a drink. He gave that little of a shit about the ceremony.
Oh God, why does that sound so Scottish? It hurts.
Yeah, it does, honestly. Although honestly, it just all kind of sounds like a perfect movie moment. There's a lot of stuff in Tommy's life story that you're this sounds like it would be really good for a movie.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like adversity, right? I could honestly see this being a pure flicks movie besides the whole socialism thing.
Yeah, they would scrub the socialism off so hard.
Yes. And so as my co-host continues on to Tommy's years in college, this is where we're at this point. Okay. He's already, he has his money. He wants to go to school because, a priest, basically a priest told him to. Yeah, basically a priest for lack of a better word.
Well, it wasn't so much a priest. It was more that one of the guys who was one of the higher ups in the organization he was a part of basically said, you're really good at public speaking. You should go and join the church, especially since you seem to have a clear affinity for the Bible.
Yeah, I see. No, I mean, if you recognize his talents, why not go through with it? All right, so please, Matt, please go on.
Yes, Tommy attended Brandon University, then known as Brandon College. It's more of a religiously oriented school from what I can tell. It was established by the Baptist Church of Canada. Tommy was studying to be a minister. Still needed to make ends meet. He made his money by filling in as a minister for churches on Sundays. From what I can tell, I'm obviously not a huge expert on how training to become a minister works, but essentially this seems to be a quasi job placement sort of thing where they were allowed to fill in at some of the local churches. On Sundays, gives the regular preacher sort of a free day to work on his other sermons and have these guys actually practice doing actual sermons in front of people. And he had managed to save at least one church that was on the verge of being shuttered, demanding to ask why no one was trying to recruit the local youth into the church. And it's actually through these jobs as a minister he met his future wife Irma, who was a music student at Brandon at the time, who actually transferred to a different church just to hear Tommy preach.
Oh wow, that's if that was today, that'd be kind of stark rich behavior. But it's 20th century, no one cares. Okay, it's not like you can just hit him up with a text message and say, hey, I like you. Let's go out.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to focus too much on like the specifics of Tommy's relationship with Irma. Like, there's nothing fucked up about it, but I figure I should bring this up. The fact that, eventually he did get married to Irma, but he was like about 5 years her senior. Like, when they got married, she was like 19 or so years old, and he was 25, which I'm sure like some people could say that's like a little bit off, but even like when you factor into the fact this was the 1920s, 30s, but well, I mean, one, like she was definitely like legal by modern standards, and like it wasn't like a massive age gap, and it seemed less like Tommy was influencing her because he was in a position of authority. It wasn't like he was grooming her. It just seemed more like they just had very compatible personalities. They were both people who had very strong, charismatic kind of personalities, so they definitely like gravitated towards each other. But
So,
I
wait,
feel
when
it's
did it
worth
work?
mentioning in case like that's like a moment of
course,
concern when people
course.
like look more into this.
Yeah, look, guys. It is very common at that time period to marry young. Okay, my grandma was 16 when she got married. Granted, it was to my grandfather, who was only 2 years older, but it's still extremely common at this point. So go on, please go on.
Yeah. Oh, and I should also note this is something I really loved about learning about Brandon College at this time. The big two programs they had at Brandon College at the time were the ministry stuff, teaching kids to become ministers, and geology. So, like digging in the ground, looking for fossils and ore and stuff like that. Since they were like a relatively small college and like a much less densely populated part of the country, especially back then, they were often short for cash. So what would often happen is they had like these kids filling in for ministers and as part of geology teams to help bring in extra money. Like, oh, hey, we'll give you a couple of our geology students to fill out your team, and that'll like help cover some of our bills. But the thing is, sometimes they would be short some students, so sometimes they would be like sending kids from the ministry program to go to geology sites and sending geologists to go preach at churches.
Oh God!
See, this is why like we found an Albertosaurus but never a Winnipegosaurus. You had all these kids learning to be ministers trying to dig for fossils. Like, what do you mean? This is like this is older than 6,000 years? Bullshit!
I dare you to try to disprove the Bible. Oh, so funny. We're getting super off track. We're sorry, guys. Okay, it's just so interesting.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be saved in the edits. He said worryingly.
Yes. Hey. Okay, I'm an all right editor. Okay, don't.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's just save it in the edit is always like kind of like a thing that's really dicey to say.
Yes. No. If anyone, okay, guys, if for a future reference, if anyone ever says we'll touch it up in post, get out of there quick.
Yeah. That's often a very sus thing to say, especially like if it's a lower budget production.
Yes. So if any of you are ever working in like any kind of industry, whether it be movies or TV, if someone says, "Oh, we'll fix it up in post," get out of there quick, because they're clearly not going to fix it in post.
There are ways you can save things in post, but that requires very skilled editors and people who have like a lot of time. And even then, editors can only work with what they're given. And so like if you're not giving them very high quality stuff to work with, there's only so much they can do to try and save it.
Exactly. So after going on that tangent once again, please continue.
Okay, yeah. Despite being a religious school, Brandon College was influenced by the more radical politics of Western Canada at the time. Despite many of the freshmen being fundamentalists, the school actually bothered to force students to question their core assumptions and introducing them to the concept of the social gospel. In something that sounds like a PragerU faux outrage topic, this Christian school taught a class on socialism, of which Tommy was one of the students. Yeah, like I should point out that the thing with Western Canada is that Western Canada, I mean, one thing you kind of learn about Canadian politics is that all the provinces kind of have like a very like adversarial relationship with each other throughout its history, and specifically with the West, namely like the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, is that they often have a certain amount of resentment to people from the eastern provinces, specifically Ontario and Quebec, because that's where most of the population is, that's where most of the big companies are based. It's very similar to how in America people from areas like the Midwest or the Southwest kind of resent people from the West and East coasts.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the situation is that because, I mean, a big part of the reason why the western part of Canada was settled was because, you know, there was more potential arable land. And, well, immediately part of it was just so the Americans wouldn't try to snatch up that part of the territory. But
yeah, of course.
a lot of it was just so that they would have people out there so they could get the resources of agriculture and later resources like oil and mining and ship that to companies in the East to profit from. And so it led to this situation where the class dynamic of settlers in the western provinces was to view like folks from Ontario and Quebec with a certain amount of resentment. And it's still like it influences the politics of that part of Canada today. If you're a conservative in Alberta and you want to like win the office, you try to pick a fight with Ottawa or Quebec or both, because like you're basically, you know, thumbing your nose at people who like are seen as the elites who keep trying to boss around like these working class people who are just trying to do what they want. It's like, especially in Alberta, it's basically a defining thing to sort of define yourself as being like against the eastern part of the country.
Yeah, because why not? Why not?
Yeah.
Canadian politics is wild, guys. Even for an American, for like myself, I can't keep up with it.
While at Brandon, Tommy would become a prominent member of the debate team, being the only Canadian team to beat the touring British Imperial team. He would also get his first taste of political power as the head of the student government, although there's not much information on like what exactly he said or did as part of the student government. It was just breezed over. During his senior year, Tommy Douglas accepted the invitation to supply, which basically means fill in, as the minister at the Calvary Baptist Church in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. In June 1930, Tommy would be ordained there, age 25. He would marry Irma in August of that same year.
Okay.
Tommy came to Saskatchewan at a pretty pivotal time, one caught in the grip of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and political corruption. It's common now here in 2020 to describe all the bullshit that's happening right now as the end of the world, and that's not without good reason. I'm not dug at anybody for saying it's like, oh, you know, like if you think now is bad, actually the past was worse and things are constantly getting better, or whatever is centrists who like don't pay attention to anything bad that's going on like to say. But it's what's easy to forget is that the Great Depression was also a very apocalyptic era in and of itself, at least if you were someone living through it. The great capitalist economies of the world crashed hard, driving millions into extreme poverty overnight. Many people were forced to sell their homes and farms, unable to afford their rent or mortgage payments. Even by the 1940s, most of the farmers in Saskatchewan would basically be tenant farmers. A combination of mass increases of farmland and severe drought rendered a large portion of the North American interior into a massive desert, creating large dust storms that would engulf whole communities as they blow through, you know, the Dust Bowl. And in Saskatchewan, the winters, because, you know, that part of Canada is just a lot of flat grassland, the winters would bring massive blizzards, often so dense that it wasn't uncommon for farmers to freeze to death feet away from their front doors because the storm was so thick they couldn't even see their porch lights. And on top of this was an era of political corruption. Conservative Prime Minister R.B. Bennett was, like his American counterpart in Herbert Hoover, failing to do anything about the Depression that involved serious government intervention in the economy. On the provincial level, Saskatchewan had long been ruled by the Liberal Party, whose reign had been marked by systematic corruption. James Garfield Gardner, the previous premier, used his connections in the Ministry of Highways to make organizations that make sure organizations supported the Liberal government, or else they would not receive government grants. You know, they would say like, oh, hey, you want to build like a new building or something? Well, you know, if you say anything bad about our government, you know, there's no funds are going to come in. And he would use a very similar thing with relief committees, where it's like, oh, yo, your town is suffering pretty hard from the Depression. Well, that money is going to the support for like the homeless and stuff is going to dry up if you try to fight against our government in any serious way. But at this time, when Tommy had come over, the government had actually been overtaken by the Provincial Conservative Party, who had gotten help through the newly established branch of the Ku Klux Klan, actually. You know, this was like the second Ku Klux Klan, where they were, as well as being like a bunch of shitty white supremacists, were also like a pyramid scheme, and they would usually integrate themselves into the politics of whatever local area they just established in. Like, you know, they did this in Oregon, they did this in Illinois, they did this in every like place where they established a branch. They just infiltrated all the levels of power that they could.
No, of course. That's what the Ku Klux Klan does.
Yeah. especially like in the 1920s and 30s. The economy was in shambles, vast swaths of farmland had been turned into deserts, and the government was too busy looking after their own interests to really do anything. So, is it any wonder why so many people turn to radical solutions to such dire straits? And Tommy was going through like a bit more of a radical shift himself at the same time. In 1931, he took a summer trip to Chicago in preparation for his sociology PhD. He was I forget the exact term, but it's basically he was working on it like remotely, essentially. Like he wasn't going to the actual like college campus. He was just learn it well also for the church in Weyburn. Here he saw the Depression was not only affecting the poor and uneducated, but even those in massive cities. To quote from Doris Shackleton's book, "We found fellows who had worked on the railroads, bank clerks, some of who had graduated in law and even medicine, and they couldn't find anything to do. It was impossible to describe the hopelessness." While in Chicago, he met then leader of the Socialist Party of America, Norman Thomas. While Tommy would remain friends with Norman until Norman's death in 1968, Tommy didn't really seem to care for the Socialist Party itself. He described the meetings he attended as being full of Marxist hardliners who would rather, discuss how things would work after the revolution rather than to try and run candidates in the local Chicago City Council. He wanted change now, not in another time and place. Which, on one hand, I get it. I've talked to these sorts of people online, like, the sort of people who are like, there's no bother, like, engaging in electoralism, which, I mean, that's like a debate in and of itself, but I at least believe you should at least try and, like, keep things from getting so shitty. Like, I'm not an accelerationist by any sort of stretch.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it's also kind of shitty because if you know anything about the history of the American Socialist Party, they kind of got whooped by the American government because of the First World War, and this was around the time of the Palmer raids. So I don't blame them for not being very optimistic.
No, I get it. Yeah.
But back in Weyburn, Tommy got to work improving things for people of the town. He set up an odd job agency where unemployed townsfolk could make money doing repairs and shoveling sidewalks. He also organized study groups for high schoolers and even convinced a retired English professor and other post-secondary graduates to help young people take extramural university courses. He even collected money from the local ministerial association to pay for freight trains to deliver fruits and vegetables in BC that would have otherwise been thrown out, which, as somebody who really hates the fact that so much food gets wasted for shitty reasons, I really appreciate that.
Because especially back then during the Depression, like every ounce of food counted, right? And people throwing out food was kind of unnecessary. Like there was clearly other people who needed that food more than the people throwing it out.
In 1932, Thomas wrote to Independent Labour Party MP J.S. Woodsworth. This is different from like the British Independent Labour Party. This was a Canadian sort of equivalent. This was a bunch of former left-leaning liberal MPs and independent who were in Parliament at the time under the idea of supporting like labor movements and stuff like that. And they'd been Woodsworth himself had been like an MP since like 1921, so he had like a certain level of clout among Canadian progressives. And Tommy, he wanted to know like just what more could be done to fight the poverty of the Depression. It just so happened that Woodsworth got a letter from M.J. Coldwell on the same subject. Coldwell, an alderman on the Regina City Council, was also looking for answers. Woodsworth sent letters to both men to get them in contact with each other. MJ and his 15-year-old son Jack jumped in their car and drove to Weyburn. After an awkward moment where Coldwell mistook Irma for Tommy's daughter, the two met in Tommy's study.
Oh my God.
Yeah, okay. It was a very sitcom-y moment.
I just have to say, if at any point people mistake your wife for your daughter, you've done something wrong. Mm-hmm. You've done something wrong.
Like, even if it's the 1930s, like, that's pretty sus.
Yeah, that's pretty sus. I mean, if they loved each other, and it was I'm willing to excuse a certain extent to it because of the time period. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's not okay.
Yeah, like it's definitely something where I'm like, this isn't like the worst example of a historical figure like having like a younger spouse, but it's definitely something that's very like iffy.
Yeah, no, man, like Jerry Lee Lewis marrying his 13-year-old cousin, that's not okay. I still can't believe the guy had a career after that.
Yeah, who's that guy? King Leopold. He had like an affair with like a 16-year-old prostitute or something.
Oh yeah, I mean, history's just chock full of stuff. He's I wouldn't say he's good, but he's definitely not the worst.
Yeah, at least she was like of legal age, and like he was only like 5 years older than her.
Mm-hmm. 5.5, because she was 19, right, when they got married, and he was 25.
Yeah.
Okay. If this sounds like we're excusing something, please, we're not. We're thoroughly condemning any sort of underage, marriage and stuff like that. That's not okay. I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis. I'm just saying, like, that guy was not okay.
Yeah, no, never do that. I'm just saying, like, this particular example just barely skirts standard I would have for like not like rapey kind of marriage like this. It's still like in suspicious territory for me,
mm-hmm.
but like it's not like outright red flags. It's like an orange or yellow flag.
It's an orange flag. No. It's oh my god, what's the thing they use for beaches? It's a blue flag. Yeah. It's like, be careful. It's like, be careful. You're going into very suspect territory.
Yeah.
All right.
Coldwell and Douglas quickly became fast friends. Douglas agreed to have his loose association of farmers and local labor unions join the Independent Labor Party. A rally was held where Douglas was elected the president of the local ILP branch. But while some in the town tried to frame this as Douglas being duped by the Reds, most of Tommy's congregation supported him because, he was a popular local figure. So, like there were obviously like people who didn't like him, namely like a lot of the city's like lawyers and other higher up sort of types who didn't like the fact that he had like these left sort of tendencies that like made them very uncomfortable for probably reasons that should be very obvious, like the same sort of like reaction that makes like, who was that guy on CNN who like thought that if Bernie Sanders became the president he'd be dragged out into the street and shot?
Oh my god. Oh, I don't remember.
Chris Matthews, that motherfucker.
Chris, okay, yeah, you're right. God. You gotta love people for Red Scare tactics.
Oh yeah, there's gonna be a lot of Red Scare tactics in this episode. Like,
yes, yeah, I think this is a good place to separate our next part, mostly because the next part we're going to talk about is Tommy running for office. So please, if you'd like to listening to this first part, please listen to the second part. It just gets more interesting from here.
Oh yeah, and like we're going to be getting into some like real juicy stuff. Like there's going to be like communists. There's going to be Black Panthers. There's going to be strikes aplenty.
There's going to be everything. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. So please stick around for part 2. If I'm doing this editing thing correctly, it should autoplay for you on YouTube after this. So thank you, and please stick around.
And please make sure to like and subscribe to Rebels, Reds, and Radicals podcast. Follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. We'll provide the links below in the description. And join us for part 2. And remember, healthcare is a human right.
Don't count me out when I'm on the floor. We'll win again. We've won before. The streets will ring with a mighty roar. 'Cause you can't break me. Stocks rise up on workers' backs. Profits soar while you hand out the sack. Boardroom bullies bloated and fat, but you can't break me.